All right, folks, we're up for another edition of The Big Picture here. We're taking a step back from your Twitter feeds and all of the news that's been bothering you to look at things that can actually help you navigate your way through life. And for this specific episode, we're talking about the importance of forensic medicine, being able to determine the cause of crimes, cause of death, cause or the people behind certain very heinous crimes in our society.
Men will hardly ever come out and talk about being sexually assaulted. Men who have been gang raped by women, afraid of being ridiculed. Already the first person they talked to said you should be happy. Like, how can a man be raped? What people need to know is that the response to sexual stimulation is involuntary. Even if it's a man violating a man, there's negative perspectives about the police, but they do a lot for victims. So the system is overwhelmed. That's the truth. There's just too many cases and too few people to do the work. We are seeing 15 cases, 50 cases, 100 cases a day, then there is someone working at the police stations. 2-3 times the number would not report, especially in adults.
Personally invested in this because I've been following the upsurge in cases of gender-based violence, intimate partner violence in Kenya, especially in the wake of COVID-19. It's become somewhat of a pandemic. And this is gender-based violence, just for clarity, is gender-based violence not just violence against women, although women in Kenya are, I don't say predisposed, but predominantly the victims of gender-based violence in our country, unfortunately. Here to discuss it is an expert in forensic medicine. In fact, she studied that years ago and has been practicing that first with the police and now on her own. That's Dr. Kizzie Shako. Thank you very much for joining us here on The Big Picture. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
I appreciate that. And right behind Kizzie, also in black, coincidentally, did you guys talk?
No, I promise you we didn't.
It's Tom Mukwana from our fact-checking desk on Piga Firimbi. Tom's got a bunch of interesting facts about gender-based violence, about things that surround that whole question, and we'll be sort of chit-chatting throughout the show. So Kizzie, awesome. What we also do on the show is we try and educate people about the various ways in which they can be misinformed, various incidents of disinformation, so that they can come away from the show not just with the knowledge that you give them, but just broadly speaking, a toolkit, so to speak, of how to be able to navigate their way through this infodemic that we are currently facing and will face for the foreseeable future. But that's a little later, Tom. But skiza kwa makini. I like to tease him. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So Kizzie, I want to start with that famous, or I don't want to call it infamous, but it was an urgent speech by the former President Uhuru Kenyatta, who, in recognition of the upsurge in cases of gender-based violence in the home, decided that the government should start to investigate that a lot more keenly. Now, you've had your ear to the ground for a number of years, and not just your ear to the ground, you've really been dealing with the victims of gender-based violence. What, to you, is the situation today? Are we dealing with it better than we are? Is it a bias, for instance, from observers, casual observers like me, from the number of cases in the news, about the number, just the sheer quantum of cases? Where are we really?
That's a very good question. So many of us in the field have observed that, as you say, there has been a rise in the number of cases reported, a rise in the number of cases reported even in the media. And also within our various institutions, there's actually a very sharp, significant increase in the number of cases that are reported across all institutions. I attribute this increase also to, the cases themselves, but also the knowledge of reporting.
Yeah.
So I believe more and more people have learned that, this is a crime and it needs to be reported. It's not something that we should keep silent or hide anymore. And so I think there's a twofold reason for that increase. However, in regards to the response, there are improvements in the response from the various institutions as well. There's a lot of talk and discussions and reforms around the response and prevention to sexual and gender-based violence across the sectors. We are getting there slowly. In fact, I know that currently the National Council on Administration of Justice is looking through the Sexual Offences Act and other related laws just to come around, to come up with a more practical way to address these issues. Yeah. And so are the others. Even the prosecution and the police have initiated polycare. They had initiated gender desks, which are solely for the purposes of responding or providing access to justice to survivors of these incidents. So there's an increase in the knowledge about the need to improve systems, and there's also action being taken to bring about an improvement in the different sectors.
I think I was in a newsroom when gender desks were first sort of like rolled out across the country, and that was years ago, possibly over a decade and a half since. And I've always wondered about their effectiveness. Not so much because I have any, real knowledge about whether they've changed the landscape in terms of reporting of sexual and gender-based crimes, but whether really, we have that kind of capacity. Sometimes it feels to me like they were a response to, some political heat that people were facing, and the police had to do something, and now we have a gender desk. But what actually has been the impact of gender desks?
Yes, I completely understand your perspective. So gender desks are assigned officers specifically to address sexual and gender-based violence and child abuse cases that are reported to them. There have been various schools of thought about the impact. I would really like to see a day when we actually conduct an assessment into this, because then we can have solid data that can inform policy. And that's something I hope to see very soon. However, I can add that when I worked in the police surgery, I would interact with these gender desk officers every day. Actually, if they're not there, then we don't get cases because they can't come on their own. And so I can tell you that, if we are seeing 15 cases, 50 cases, 100 cases a day, then there is someone working at the police stations. I also know that a lot of the times the ones I would see frequently they're very passionate about what they do. Very, very passionate. A lot have learned the ropes, as they go through their daily routines. So they've learned on the job, and they do a lot beyond the call of duty. And this is something that I know people don't understand. These, sometimes there's negative perspectives about the police, but they do a lot for victims. It's actually amazing to watch. And the fact that cases even get to court means that there are police officers working, because without them it can't get to court. So there may be some cracks here and there, but definitely there is work being done.
Okay.
As for the impact, like I said, we would need to have a study to base our responses on about that.
I want to ask about your own personal experience, what you think the most successful case that engaged, the skill set of people like yourself studying in forensic medicine, that went from one end to the other. It might be something that you've handled, but what do you think is that case that can be a standard bearer for why we need the services of medical professionals in forensic medicine?
That's a tough one, because so many of them are still in court, but I can think of one. There's, I think it's the Willie Kimani case. And it was not just forensic medicine, but forensic sciences as a whole. There was a lot of, I played a role in assessing the murder suspects for their capacity to stand trial. And of course, there was the forensic pathologists who identified the manner in which the victims were killed. There was the police forensics, which looked into, telecommunication, DNA analysis of cigarette butts, and many other things like that. So that, for me, is a really good case to showcase the value of forensic science and medicine in investigations and in accessing justice.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Willie Kimani case. I mean, we've followed it here as well, and we've also reported on the same. And it's always stood out to me, yes, as one of those standard bearers for what happens when multiple agencies within, the justice sort of framework in the country work together, right? And I'm not saying this to denigrate or to make light of the crimes that were perpetrated against Willie, Josephat, and Joseph, but it was a fairly high-profile case.
Yes, it was.
How many other cases have walked into your office or have been brought to your desk at the time you were working with the police that merit that kind of, that kind of work rate and that kind of work that just don't get it?
I don't think we can even put a figure to it.
Is that bad?
Yes, because, well, the system is overwhelmed. That's the truth. There's just too many cases and too few people to do the work. It also requires a lot of very good coordination. What you saw there was a well-coordinated case where everyone knows what it is they're doing. I know because I've worked with when dealing with the dead as well, especially when you have disaster settings, the crime agencies involved are very well coordinated. You can see how everyone knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing, which basically that's what efficiency is all about.
Yeah.
But I don't see that when it's with the living cases, living injured persons. That level of coordination sometimes is missed. Not sometimes, many times it's absent because there are too many different institutions that are required. So if I just walk you through a victim's life cycle, they will be, maybe this incident has occurred, there's been a rape incident. Then they have to figure out what to do. Who do I tell? Should I tell? Should I not? So let's say a community leader is informed. Then they have to call someone else probably and say, you need to go to the police station. So they go to a police station, then they're told, okay, did you go to the hospital? You need to go to the hospital first. So you go to the hospital, get a medical report, get treatment, then go back to the police. Then they get, they do their OB, occurrence book number, take your statements, issue a P3 form. You know about the P3 form?
Yeah.
Then it has to go back to another medical person. It's filled out, then it's taken back to the police station. Then it can proceed now to the prosecution and to trial, depending on what the prosecutors decide.
You've just rattled off almost 10 steps.
Yes.
Now, if I were a victim of a sexual crime, I have the crime itself on my mind, the trauma of it. Am I willing to go through all of those steps?
Many are not. And you see, it's not even about the number of different institutions. It's the way they'll be received at those institutions and the other barriers that they have to cross when they're at those institutions.
Yeah.
So, you hope to receive a person who's compassionate, even at the medical sector, someone who won't say, what were you doing, how are you dressed, but you're drunk, things like that. You hope to be received by someone who understands the need for privacy and confidentiality and won't shout across the room, this is a rape case, go to this door. Yeah. Because those things happen. Really? And then, yes, they do. There's a lot of, we need to increase or boost the training on trauma-informed care and gender-sensitive care, which is lacking across the sectors, even at community level. And it is a barrier. Several survivors will say, the way I was handled at this facility or whichever institution made me just drop the case. I didn't want any more.
If there are that many barriers, how many other opportunities are there to interfere with the evidence that you would need to be able to prove a case?
That's the very problem. When you have all these barriers, there's a delay across the chain of events. And in that delay, especially with forensic evidence, from the minute the crime takes place, evidence is lost. You know, there's an exchange of matter, there's an exchange of trace evidence, there's biological matter that has been exchanged, but it won't stay on the victim for long. It will keep being, you know, it will keep getting lost. If there's biological fluids, they'll just keep dripping, and you know, eventually there'll be nothing left. Showers will be taken, clothes will be washed, clothes will be burnt or discarded, which is what we see a lot of. So there's numerous, the longer it takes, the more the chances that evidence will be lost. And also interference by suspects, offenders, or their families or their allies. There's a lot of that. And then, of course, there's the need to make payments for certain documents, which really should be removed from the system. Those are the various, you know, those are the immediate barriers that many survivors face.
So if you were, and we're being anecdotal about this.
Yes.
So if we're saying 10 cases are reported, right? How many more cases do you think are out there that go unreported simply because of these kinds of bottlenecks, these kinds of barriers?
I don't have a figure, unfortunately, but there must be quite a number. I would say 2 to 3 times, but this is just off the top of my head. 2 to 3 times the number would not report, especially in adults. For adults, it's worse because adult females are probably married, they are working, they have obligations, they cannot take time to do all that running around I've just talked about, looking for money to fund it. Those are, that's what I think. But yes, it would need a study as well, so that we can get proper data. Yeah,
and we spoken about the upsurge, that spike in the number of reported cases, predominantly you know, focused on women as being victims of sexual and gender-based violence. But one of the retorts by some of the people who are critical of the manner or the slant in which these kinds of cases are reported, especially in the media, is that when a case happens against a man, it doesn't quite get the same kind of prominence, relevance, etc. But I just want to know from you, like in terms of the numbers, did we also see a spike in the cases of sexual and gender-based violence where men were victims?
I saw increase in, the ones I personally saw, was an increase in men who had been victims of violence following a drug-facilitated, drug use. What I mean is they were at specific places, maybe having fun, social gathering, and then their drinks are drugged. That is what I found really, really interesting. That's what I noticed was different. And in all of them, they were violated, but they don't know by who. That's the trend that I noticed was definitely very high.
They were violated in which ways?
Physically, and some were robbed. Men will hardly ever come out and talk about being sexually assaulted, very rarely. I think I can count the number I've seen on 2 hands, and that's over 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah, okay. They hardly ever come out with that because officially, you know, like formally go and report in a police station, that one I hardly ever see that.
That's a problem.
Yes, it is. But I will get others reach out to me unofficially, you know, through Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, or through a friend who have been gang raped by women, who have been physically assaulted by women, yes. But they cannot bear to go and report it because shame, stigma, you know, they're afraid of being ridiculed. Already the first person they talked to said you should be happy. I mean, you got all those things for free.
I was actually about to ask that. We are now in a room full of men. Unfortunately, not one crew member here is female, but
it's fine.
That shall be remedied. And
yes,
I'm asking,
balancing.
yes, I'm asking this with the men in the room and others in mind. That question, especially that statement that you were raped by a woman, you should be happy. How does it play? I think one of the questions that men ask is, how does, you know, rape play out when the victim is a man and the perpetrator is a woman? considering just the mechanics of how, sexual intercourse happens. And is that our traditional understanding of sexual intercourse the only way in which a man can be assaulted sexually?
So I know for very many people that is a very interesting question. Like, how can a man be raped? Like, how does that even work? But it does. And the cases I came across and still come across, there's usually drugs or alcohol involved. So the man is already significantly, he's dull. He's dulled down. His senses are not, he's not alert. And so he's easy to overpower. And also, the other thing I picked up was that usually there's many females. Not usually, but what I saw. I'm talking about my own experiences.
Yeah.
There were many females, like 3 or 4 females. I remember one in particular saying that he woke up and found these women doing things to him, and he couldn't move because they had tied him up and everything. So what people need to know is that the response to sexual stimulation is involuntary. Your brain does not say, I am now going to respond. It's not you don't tell your mind to do it. It just happens. So if someone starts, touching, let's say, a man, for example, whether he wants it or not, his body may respond.
Yeah.
And once his body responds, then intercourse can take place. It's as simple as that, really, and that is how men are raped. It's not only the only way that can happen. There's also anal intercourse. Things can be inserted in the anus. Things can be put in his mouth. There are very many different kind of things that take place that are very violating, very humiliating.
I think for me, yes, all of those are well understood and incredibly humiliating. I think that's part of the reason why a man wouldn't want to, to talk about it, because it somewhat disempowering of the man, and it kind of strips him of his quote-unquote manhood, right?
Exactly.
But what I found particularly interesting, and I have to admit, I was today years old when I found that out, that it's involuntary.
Yes.
That a man can be, stimulated, even if he doesn't want to,
yes.
and sexual intercourse can take place. So that's really interesting. I want to move to something else.
And even by men.
And even by men.
Even if it's a man violating a man, the victim's body may still respond. Okay. Which is why they get confused. Like, am I a homosexual? Is that a bad thing? Have I lost my identity? They get very, very confused because their bodies responded to the stimulation that they did not want. That's
interesting, especially I'm thinking within the context of jail, right? Where these kinds of things happen often. They're so storied that's part of the reason why nobody wants to go to jail. The whole drop the soap phenomenon, etc. But that can affect someone's mental perception of their sexual identity when in fact it was something involuntary is really telling, and that might be something that people ought to be told a lot more.
Yes, they should. Even in the criminal justice sector, they need to understand how it works.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I want to move to another topic, which is it's related to sexual and gender-based crimes, but more broadly speaking to crime, which is DNA evidence, right? So the way we think it works out here is that someone will have left hair and will have, sweated somewhere, or or will have spat, etc. And the police come with a swab and they're able to disaggregate one person's DNA from the soil from someone else's. But how does it really work? How do you get like clean DNA profiles that are then actionable in court and can identify the individual?
So I'll talk more about during a forensic examination, for example, in a sexual offense case. So if we look at the living, let's use the living because we are on gender issues. So during a forensic medical examination, first of all, it's important to remember or to note that when there is an incident where a person violates another and there's been an exchange of matter, what happens is that the perpetrator will leave, biological material on the victim, and there'll be an exchange. So they'll both live with bits of each other, so to speak. So we lose a lot of hair, we sweat, you have skin cells that shed, saliva, fingerprints. There's, it's very difficult to not leave a trace of yourself. And so what we do is when we're dealing with the victim, what we want is to find that evidence that could point towards a crime or a person that violated them. And so what we look for is, based on the history, what the survivor will tell us is what will guide us as to where to look for, what to look for, where to look and what to look for. So if there's a history of maybe, there was licking and touching and biting, we'll want to swab that area to get a sample that can possibly provide the DNA profile of the offender. So that will be taken to the lab by the police officers to maintain chain of custody. And then the police will also examine the area. Ideally, this is what should be done, and unfortunately, it's not always doable. And that's a problem everywhere, not just here. They'll also assess the crime scene, where it actually took place, and look for any kind of evidence that may be there. It can be used condoms, it can be shoes, it can be gloves, it can be anything that they find, including hairs. If hair is seen somewhere, it has to be collected. But that would normally be gathered from the victim for purposes of comparative analysis with possible foreign hair. So I won't go into the nitty-gritty bits, but that's how it's done. So the victim, the suspect, and the location are all crime scenes.
Okay. You mentioned this to me off camera.
Yes.
The government chemist has been doing this for years.
Very many years.
Very many years.
Yes.
Do we have a database, a DNA database, on the number of people whose DNA has been gathered over these years? With, in my own fantastical thinking of how this should work, that if there's an evidence bank, then it should lead you to certain serial offenders. I was giving you the case of Master Wanjala in 2021. All of the children that were killed that were eventually linked to him posthumously, and also while he was alive, leading officers to the crimes, might have been linked to him much earlier, and possibly maybe some of them would have been alive.
Saved, rescued. So the government chemist would be best placed to answer questions about a database. However, I do know that when samples are analyzed and DNA profiles are generated from the samples, that information is stored. It's not discarded. It may not be used, but it's not discarded, so it's there. But we would have to have a very robust legal framework to govern the way DNA evidence, DNA profiles are stored, who can access them, for what reasons, by who, because it's, it's very sensitive information, So that's where we are at, kind of. And right now I know there's a lot of African states are grappling with how to go around DNA bank, DNA database legislative frameworks, so that all these areas are taken into account. You don't want people misusing other people's DNA profiles.
I want to ask one last question about how you would set up a specific crime scene in order for us to be able to gather as much evidence as possible. And I want to talk about Shakahola. If you were managing that entire crime scene, right? How would you do it, start to finish, so that we can get as much evidence from every body that's brought out of the ground, aside from the evidence that's going to be gathered from the living, which is also, very important? How would you manage the entire crime scene to ensure that at the end of the day, Kenyans get the answers that they want?
Well, first of all, what should be done, first of all, especially because you're dealing with the dead, and yes, time is of the essence, but there's a very crucial stage, which is planning. You have to actually sit, all the agencies come together and plan how they're going to execute it. So you'd have to have a work plan. That's the first thing. And a list of who is involved in the execution of this work plan. So that would involve the assessing or identifying the persons, the professionals who would be involved in this. So how many forensic pathologists do we have? How many pathologists? How many forensic dentists? We only have 2 in the country, but they are so key in this aspect. Who is available?
Forensic dentists.
2.
For a population of 50 million people?
Yes, exactly. Only 2. We need more.
Yeah.
In case anyone wants to venture into that field. It's an interesting field. So yes, we only have 2. Forensic practitioners are very few. If you look at them, all the different ones, there are few. You'd also need to have people from the professionals at the government chemist. So those are the forensic scientists. At this stage, what they do is collect actually swabbing of the samples, the areas that need to be swabbed. So if you retrieve a dead body or a corpse, they would be the ones to kind of sample the areas. You'd need to have the police, of course, to cordon off the scene. You have to have discussions around what area will be covered, how far are we going, is it 5 kilometers, is it 100 meters? What do we need to be able to do that? Will the community fight us or not? So you have to speak to the community leaders in that area. The police in that area are actually the most important people or personnel involved in ensuring that you'll actually execute without problems. You can't just go into a place and start digging up areas. There's also an arm of forensic sciences that allows use of satellites to establish disturbances in the ground. Then you don't have to just blindly search, but you can search in very specific areas because you can be seen. Yeah. But I don't think that's doable here. I know it's done in various parts of the world, but it's not always the case. Yeah. So that's how we would execute, which is, I'm sure, what is being done now, because the forensic human identification team is well established, or the disaster victim identification team. They're well established and have really understood how everyone is supposed to work. Yeah. So they do a very good job.
My assumption is that there should be something akin to like a field hospital where a lot of this happens on site, just so that a lot of evidence isn't lost in transfer, etc. But
yes, that's exactly what would happen. And sometimes even, I believe ICRC provides like a mobile store, cold room for bodies or samples or whatever. So during the work plan, it will be decided where are samples going to be, where will they be placed, how will we code them, how are we going to preserve them, who's going to collect them, what is the chain of custody, do we have the form, who's going to sign, all those, every last detail is indicated. So that there's no loss of evidence and no confusion. And then, of course, there's a team that will look for family members to get some more DNA samples from them and information, because you need to know these bodies, many of them will be decomposed beyond you can't be able to identify them. So it would require a forensic human identification process which looks into fingerprints, studying the skeletal remains to come up with a biological profile, sampling for DNA evidence, and then that will be compared with the families who are alive will also provide their samples from the mouth, and the DNA profiles will be generated, and this will be compared with the samples from the deceased. Yes. So it's a very, very intense, project and very exhausting, but very rewarding.
Because I'm thinking about the end rather than the beginning where we are, that this should wind up in court. There should be, we're discussing with Hussein Khaled from Haki Africa, and one of the debates that's happening right now at the DPPs is, what do you charge Paul Mackenzie with?
Yes,
right?
I'm also waiting to see.
Because with the lack of that kind of evidence of there being a crime in which he directly participated or managed, in some sort of way, and that relies not just on, the fact that people say he led them in this direction, but that there actually has to be evidence, and that's a forensic process.
Yes, there is a forensic process and a legal one. And many times when you hear, a case was dropped because of insufficient evidence, Sometimes, I can see the outrage in the public, but you understand from a legal perspective, how do you tie this to this in a manner that it can actually stand trial? And that's where problems can arise sometimes.
Okay. Kizzie, I want to turn you over to Tom. He's got a couple of questions for you. He's just been here listening intently, and I'm sure there are a couple of things that he wants to ask about. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm scared.
I'm kind enough to not be harsh. So 2 questions. First of all, before we get into the fact check, have you handled cases of, just not to say it in a blanket statement like intimate partner violence, but within spousal relationships?
In the living or the dead?
In the living.
Living.
Yeah.
Yes, I have severally. When I worked actively at the police surgery, I would see about 20 to 30 in a day.
Cases of?
Intimate partner violence, yes.
Wow. Intimate partner sexual violence?
Sexual, they usually don't report that. You have to dig it out of them and ask questions. So part of the history taking is really being able to conduct a good interview and get as much information out as possible. So most intimate partner violence victims are women, which is why it's called gender-based violence, because it's skewed towards women as victims. They will talk about, they may report, he assaulted me. But then when you ask deeper, did he do this in front of the children? What else was done? Were you ever forced to engage in sexual intercourse when you are actively saying no, stop, don't? And almost all of them say yes. But they don't report that. Yeah.
Because it's the husband, because
it's the husband. Many times they don't know they've been raped. Many believe a man cannot rape his wife. So there's that awareness that is absent about what is rape. Yeah. Even women don't know many times that this is actually a rape that has taken place.
So interesting. Tom, you wrote about this quite recently, actually. Yeah, I did. Yeah, sorry, your second question, Tom.
Oh, the second question.
I hope I've answered you.
Yes, yes, very well. And it's disturbing that so many people don't think rape can exist within a marriage.
And also many men don't think it's possible. So we need to educate on what consent is, what does no mean,
All right. Now to the fact check. A lot of people have been tweeting about abortion being legal or illegal in Kenya. So I'm just trying to understand if it is actually legal or illegal, because there was also a court case last year that by the High Court, a ruling by the High Court that made it legal to induce abortion in some instances. So yes, if you can look at this here, it says, this person says abortion is illegal, then someone says it's legal.
Abortion is legal in Kenya, legalized around March this year. Really? Yeah. Well, the last I checked, abortions are illegal. Termination of pregnancy is not legal, except when a medical practitioner indicates that it is necessary for the sake of saving the mother's life. If it's going to be harmful to the mother, then termination of pregnancy is permitted. Yes, and yeah, that's the last I checked. So I don't think you can just walk into a hospital and say, I want an abortion. That's not, that will not work out very well for you. But it is a controversial area because there's schools of thought that say, women should be able to control their bodies and what happens to their bodies, but others are saying we need to preserve life. So where do we draw the line? Yeah. But I'll check into that ruling.
I have one final question before we get into our tradition here, and I hope you don't mind me asking. But I was just thinking about someone like you who's involved in forensic science, right? This question is asked of me, by the way.
Okay.
Like, can your kids ever cheat you? Like if they come home and say, I haven't done my homework, how would you go around a forensic investigation into whether homework has been done? Then of course the question of the spouse. I'm always asked, hey man, you like, can you ever cheat your wife or the other way around? You know,
it will be very hard.
Yes.
We can sniff it from a mile away.
From a mile away.
Yes.
Okay.
And you know which questions to ask and to read body language.
All right.
Yes.
That question I asked specifically for your husband so that he knows now to be able to avoid the questions studiously. Yeah, but thank you very much, Kizzie. I really appreciate the time and the insights. Very interesting conversation we've had here. I've learned a couple of things, like I told you about, the question of stimulation of men. That's very interesting, how rape happens with men.
Yeah.
But I think the last question really around Shakahola and how to be able to set it up should be able to leave little doubt in people's minds about what they are seeing versus what they are not seeing and what they should expect of such an important investigation in our country. So many thanks to you for coming to clarify this.
You're welcome.
Everybody here, I'm sure, appreciates this. They would give you they would clap for you if they weren't handling their cameras, right? Well, Steve's clapping. So Louis here has been watching you intently, studying your every move. And he has a gift for you, which is part of our tradition.
Oh my gosh.
So I get a first look.
That's ladies first.
Not here. But this is cool. I'm sure you like it. Here.
I'm so excited.
Yeah, that's
Oh my God. Look at this.
Pack of the brown highlights in the hair.
And the red lipstick.
Yes.
And the cat eyes.
Yes.
I love it.
Yeah.
This is mine.
It is yours to keep, but not now. At the end of the season, we send to everybody who's on the big picture. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you all. You guys are awesome. I had fun.
We are awesome. Have we heard?
Yeah, you
follow
are.
us.
All of
follow
you.
us. Follow us.
I had a blast.
Right. Thank you so much, Kizzie, and thank you guys for watching another episode, I should say, of The Big Picture. Like we always do around this time, we are, requesting you, if you want to join our Patreon, become a patron of Africa Uncensored. Help us do more important work, more investigative work, more in-depth work, not just here, but across Africa. There's lots of stories that we want to tell, but our reach is only so far, and you, our audience, can help us do that. So just go into the link and you'll be able to follow the link, become a patron of Africa Uncensored today. Follow our work, comment on our work, even if you're critiquing it, share our work. Those things really help us be able to know what exactly it is that we should be focusing on. But as for us here on the big picture, we'd like to say a huge thanks. I'm sure Tom is also saying thank you, even though he's studiously looking at his laptop now. I know I'm reading the heart forensically. Umesema asante. And as for you, Kizzie, thank you once again.
So much. It was an honor.
Much appreciated. All right, we'll catch you on the next episode of The Big Picture. Bye for now.